What makes a murderer's mind tick? Killer Psyche is a true crime podcast from Wondery that explores these types of questions about the crimes that killers and criminals commit. Killer Psyche covers high-profile cases that have shocked the world. Host Candice DeLong uses her 5 decades of experience as a clinical psychiatrist nurse and FBI criminal profiler to dissect the motivations and behaviors of the most terrifying felons in history. You'll definitely want to listen to a recent episode of Killer Psyche where Candice explores the case of Pedro Rodrigues Filho, also known as Killer Petey, or the Brazilian Dexter. At age 14, Rodrigues murdered the deputy mayor in his town, all because the mayor had fired his father. Rodrigues went on to murder, by his count, more than 100 people, most of them while he was behind bars. To many, he was a hero, a vigilante seeking justice for victims, but to others, he was just a cold-blooded murderer. One of the highlights of the show for me personally was just how knowledgeable Candice is regarding all of the peripheral details to a case. It was fascinating to gain insights into the aspects that, generally speaking, are either overlooked or not considered in much detail when viewing what is available to the general public. Candice has a lot of expertise in her field, and the reflections she provides are really intriguing. Listen to Killer Psyche on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or you can listen ad-free by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app. In the fall of 2019, I was going through a really rough patch. I was extremely depressed and in a very dark place at the time. So when my friend invited me to go to the Davy Crockett National Forest with him to camp, I was more than happy to oblige. We decided that we would camp at the Ratcliffe Lake campgrounds for 2 nights, and then the 3rd night we would stay at a free camping spot somewhere off the miles of park roads scattered throughout the forest. The first couple of days went by amazingly too. I loved the smell of pines, especially in East Texas, and the campsite was beautiful, not to mention the lake. We did some kayaking and hiking, and the views really helped my mindset. It was awesome, but on the 3rd morning, my friend got an emergency call and had to bail at the last second. I was a little bit upset, but it didn't necessarily mean I had to go home just because he did. So I decided to stick to the original plan and find a place to camp deep within the forest. After he left, I headed to the nearest forest information center and snagged a map. The map showed the nearby highways and the forest and whatnot. I scouted a couple of park roads and made my way towards them. After about maybe 5 miles out of town, I find a park road which is indicated by a numbered sign and is only a dirt road. I head down it and settle in for the adventure. The road wasn't very narrow, but it would have been a hassle to move 2 trucks around each other, which I didn't really encounter, thankfully. I kept the map on my lap and followed the road with my fingers while also checking the road ahead for potholes and stuff. Now, the woods got super dense around me and darker as I kept going, and it all kind of just enveloped my truck at one point. I don't know how many miles I traveled before I first came to another turnoff, but it was clear that I was really deep in the woods. I traveled to where one group of campsite was supposed to be, which was a small loop basically. I turned down and, to my surprise, was met with a couple of trucks and RVs, all occupants outside cleaning guns or dressing deer. Please don't come at me, I've never been hunting. It was hunting season, so I guess it wasn't that big of a surprise, but it was still very off-putting though with the looks that I was receiving. So I made the loop and I just continued on. I drove a couple more miles and found another remote spot at the very corner of the woods. I pulled over and set up the tent and a fire and brought out the whiskey. I didn't have a great night and was just burning some letters, so I got a little bit more messed up than I would have cared to be. So I ate some food, put out the fire and headed into the tent to play the Switch and just wind down a bit. It didn't take me too long to fall asleep and I slept pretty hard that night. But I woke up at around 1 o'clock in the morning to the sound of footsteps circling my campsite. I'm a very avid camper, so I just assumed that it was a critter checking out the human who decided to chill in his pad without asking. So I started to drift off again when I heard a loud cough, and at that, I was instantly awake. I just kind of laid there listening, and the footsteps, they approached my truck. I had locked my truck, thankfully, but heard the obvious sign of someone trying to handle, then quietly shuffling over to the other side and trying the other handle. I had a spotlight that I brought with me, so I quietly unzipped the tent and pointed my light in the direction of the noise and shouted out. And I caught a brief glimpse of whoever it was in all camo sprint off into the woods with no light. Like, they took off, and although I had no plans on following them, I scanned the brush with my light and couldn't see anything. I turned off my light to see if I could see a phone light or a flashlight, but instead I heard a very loud crashing into the brush that just got quieter and further away. So, whoever this person was ran into the dark woods with no light and in all camo. Considering the map and the direction that he ran also didn't have any more roads or amenities, maybe he was on private property or something. I don't know, but I was very scared, obviously, so I collapsed my tent, put it in the bag, shoved it in my back seat, and drove the park roads like a bat out of hell that day. Once I got back to the main road, I drove for 4 hours back to my hometown, and I want to go back sometime, but this time, definitely with friends, and maybe even a gun too. But yeah, that was not a fun experience, and definitely up there with one of the most frightening things that has ever happened to me in the woods. So this happened when I was around 13 and it was summer, so that meant no more school. I would often spend my evenings with my cousin, who lived close by to me, and we would ride our bikes around the neighborhood until sunset. One day, it was the usual, but we happened to stop in front of a house and take a short break. As we're posted up just sort of talking, a middle-aged man approached us. He looked to be around maybe his 40s, tall and hairy with a big black mustache. He was wearing a grey sweatsuit with the hoodie over his hat. He looked like he just went out on a jog because he was super sweaty, but he approached us with a big grin. He then proceeded to ask for our names and what we were doing here. I quickly got the creepy gut feeling that something was off about this guy. I then realized that he was far more interested talking to my cousin in a flirty way. My cousin was only 13, just like me, but she looked a little older, although it was noticeable that she was still a minor. The creepy man kept asking questions, which I ignored because I found it odd. So my cousin kept answering his questions, and he then finally asked how old we were, and my cousin told him our age. I thought that he would finally get the memo after that and stop talking to us, but as soon as he heard our age range, he quickly had an eerie grin on his face and paused for a few seconds. He then mentioned that he has a niece our age and she would love to meet us and wants us all to become friends. He kept insisting that she would love us, and when we declined his offer, his tone changed and he started sort of gaslighting us. He kept saying that we'll make her cry if we don't go and that we're just mean girls for not going to meet her, etc. He keeps looking around our surroundings to see if anyone is nearby. He then starts offering us soda. He claims it's too hot to be outside and we should at least have a soda at his house. After saying no thank you, he keeps insisting he has all types of drinks available at home. This kept going on for a good 10 minutes as well, of him convincing us to go to his house, and we kept saying no thanks multiple times till he finally gave in and just left. He didn't say goodbye or anything, he just turned and stormed away all angry. We still lived in that area for a few more years before moving, and strangely enough, we never once saw this man ever again. Looking back at this situation, we were very vulnerable for 13 years old and would often get into trouble, and we could have easily went with him in his house to get free soda, and, well, who knows what could have happened then. And I mean, no grown man in their right mind keeps insisting that 13-year-olds should go into his house, right? It all started when I was 5 to 6 years old and had an imaginary friend called Bombo. He was a small Victorian boy who lived with his mother, who I said lived under the floorboards in the house that I grew up in. I used to talk and play with him all the time, teaching him about things like my Velcro shoes and some toys that I had. It was no secret to my family who Bombo was and even what he looked like, from how I had described him. One day though, my sister, 14 years old at the time, went back upstairs to our shared room after a family day out, and she saw him too, standing in the corner of the room staring at her, exactly how I had described him, even down to the detail of the clothes. Well, a few years passed and I was now 10 or 11 years old. Our family had moved house a couple of times, and now I lived in a 3-story house in a village just outside of my hometown. I always had a weird feeling about that house too, from the moment that we moved in, but didn't think too much about it over the excitement of having my own room on the top floor with a skylight. After a few months, things started to get a bit strange though. Things disappearing, hearing footsteps on the middle floor landing at night, just weird stuff like that. These experiences progressively ended up getting stranger too, with sounds like nails being dragged up on the railings on the top floor getting worse and worse, as well as some nights my little sister, 3 at the time, screaming saying that there was a man growling at her in her room, although my family put this down to an overactive imagination and didn't really think anything else of it. It was quiet for a couple of months though before everything just came back again, but this time so much worse. This was also the first time that I saw it. So, one night I was in my room watching TV and getting things ready for school the next day. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A face peering in at me through my skylight. Its skin was dark red and its eyes were like white with no pupils, only veins and dark circles around its eyes, leading to like black cracks across its face. It was grinning at me, and even without pupils, I knew that it had its eyes locked on me. Needless to say, after a few seconds of initial shock, I quickly ran downstairs to the rest of my family and refused to go back into my room. Shortly after this too, my older sister, who had given birth recently and was living with us temporarily, had her own experience as well. As she was sleeping one night, she heard a knock on her door at between 2 or 3 in the morning. Thinking that it was one of us knocking, she shouted "What?" twice with no response. But then, the door just flung open after a few seconds with so much force that the dresser had dented the door from the impact. She looked, but there was no one there. Shortly after that, we moved again for personal reasons to the house that we now have been in for years. For years, too, there was no unusual experiences other than the occasional sound of footsteps. Nothing that couldn't be logically explained, that is. When I was 18, though, my sleep schedule was the same as any teenager, waking up around noon and going to bed around 3 or 4 in the morning. And this one night in particular, I was up doing the same as always, listening to music, watching films, stuff like that. At midnight, or around that time, I went downstairs to the kitchen as usual to get some snacks, and on my way back up out of the kitchen, I saw it again. Standing behind the front door, looking in through one of the glass panels, was that same face that I saw all those years ago. Same red skin, same eyes, same dark circles and cracking features. It was staring right at me too, and this time with one of its hands leant on the other glass panel as it watched me. The only difference though was that this time it wasn't grinning. After standing there for what felt like forever, I ran as fast as I could up to my room and locked myself inside. I didn't sleep a wink that night too. Some family friends who were actually regular churchgoers theorized after they had heard what I saw that this thing that I had seen was actually Bombo, or what had taken the form as him in the first place, and when I had stopped giving him my attention and energy, he had then had to use another way of getting my attention. But I don't know what to think for sure, to be honest. All I know is that what I saw was the exact thing that I saw as a kid, and it came back. It's been 4 years since the last time that I saw it, and to be honest, I hope that I never see it again. What makes a murderer's mind tick? Killer Psyche is a true crime podcast from Wondery that explores these types of questions about the crimes that killers and criminals commit. Killer Psyche covers high-profile cases that have shocked the world. Host Candice DeLong uses her 5 decades of experience as a clinical psychiatrist nurse and FBI criminal profiler to dissect the motivations and behaviors of the most terrifying felons in history. You'll definitely want to listen to a recent episode of Killer Psyche where Candice explores the case of Pedro Rodriguez Filho, also known as Killer Petey, or the Brazilian Dexter. At age 14, Rodriguez murdered the deputy mayor in his town, all because the mayor had fired his father. Rodriguez went on to murder, by his count, more than 100 people, most of them while he was behind bars. To many, he was a hero, a vigilante seeking justice for victims, but to others, he was just a cold-blooded murderer. One of the highlights of the show for me personally was just how knowledgeable Candice is regarding all of the peripheral details to a case. It was fascinating to gain insights into the aspects that, generally speaking, are either overlooked or not considered in much detail when viewing what is available to the general public. Candice has a lot of expertise in her field, and the reflections she provides are really intriguing. Listen to Killer Psyche on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or you can listen ad-free by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app. Man, it makes me cringe realizing just how long ago this was. Nearly 25 years ago, when I was in my early 20s. I was sharing a house with a couple of guys. We were all in the same religious order. It was a great house to live in because, well, we kept a tidy house and a roster for housework and cooking duties. But I digress. So, me and one of the other guys had a day off, and I suggested that we go for a hike to a place that I visited every few months or so. It was a big granite outcrop in the middle of Victoria, southeastern Australia. There was a lookout at one outcrop, the lower one, that had a car park and a well-formed path to the top. And there was a dirt road that went for about 3 kilometers between that outcrop and the bigger, higher one. The dirt road curves around, but I used to like to walk through the bush between the two outcrops and climb the bigger one. These outcrops had a lot of huge granite boulders, some the size of a house even. You can climb some of them and jump from one to another like a big natural kids' playground almost. But anyway, we parked and walked up to the lookout. Nothing unusual. There wasn't anyone else around or any other cars, but this is not totally unusual for a weekday out there. We looked around at the surrounding countryside and after a few minutes walked back down the path and passed the cart across to the other outcrop. At that point, we both saw a man coming up the road, but he had 4 legs and 4 arms, it looked like. Not like they were naturally growing out of his torso, but like a video processing a glitch, where the 2 parts of the picture were doubled and sort of out of sync, one covering the other, about a third overlapping. It took a few seconds for us to actually work out what we were seeing, sort of like your brain trying to make sense of what you're looking at. I kept looking and trying to work out what was wrong with what I was seeing. I could tell by how my friend was acting too that he also saw something wrong. After maybe about probably 10 seconds, no, it felt a lot longer, we realized what we were seeing was actually what we were seeing. And at that, we both started walking really quickly the other way. We were headed back to the lookout, but the car was just 50 meters away. We started going back up the track again and then both stopped and thought, what are we doing? We need to just get back in the car, right? I could see the man getting closer, but he was still a ways off. We jumped in the car as quickly as we could, and I spun it around and got the heck out of there. Another weird thing about this guy, though, was that he was wearing a yellow tan top, maybe a jacket, and a turquoise pants. A really weird combination for where we lived. I didn't have to ask my friend, "Did you see that?" because it was obvious that he had. And as we calmed down, we kept saying, "What the heck was that? I don't know what that was, but man, I'm glad we got out of there." We eventually got to the next town and we bought some lunch and a drink, and we didn't talk about it to anyone or each other really ever again. However, now having heard some stories here, I often wonder if he saw exactly what I saw too, or if he saw something equally weird but different. So I just want to say from the outset that I don't know if this guy was just mentally disturbed and kidding, or if he was actually malicious and just failed. So I was maybe 16 years old, and I was kind of a rebellious kid. I joined Tinder to meet some older guys, and I matched with this really attractive 20-year-old that seemed really into me. Naive, I know. But he asked to pick me up from school the following day to get ice cream and walk around a nearby lake, and I said yes. He picked me up and we had a great conversation, nothing really weird, and it seemed like we really enjoyed each other's company. But when we got to the lake, no one was there because it was the middle of October and cold on the water. But we walked about halfway around the lake, and that's when it got, well, weird. So he started talking to me about crime documentaries and how he'd studied them and knew how to kill someone without getting caught. He started making tracks in the mud and said that he would want to wear 2 big shoes so the police couldn't match him on shoe size. He picked up his shoe to show me a size 10.5 and informed me that he wore an 8. At that, I got a bit uneasy. He was strolling around me while I was sitting on the bench like I was sort of prey almost. He went to one of those doggy bag dispensers and pulled one off. He sheathed it up to his elbow and started swatting it in my face. I thought that he might be trying to gross me out or something, so I was sort of half giggling and swatting it away. On one of my swats, he grabbed my forearm and pulled me in, and then put the bag over my head. Still, I thought that he might be kidding, but as I tried to get away, I noticed that he wasn't going to let up. I was starting to panic now, realizing that I wasn't getting any air, and he picked me up in a sort of headlock position. I was kicking and trying to elbow him, and I guess one of those elbows connected to his groin, and we both fell to the ground. He laughed and said, "You've got more fight in you than I thought you did. It was just going to make you pass out, but I didn't even get that far. I'm proud of you." All of my stuff, a phone, and yes, a taser as well, was in his car on the other side of the lake at this point, so I decided to play along and pretend that it was funny. I told him that I needed my inhaler now and to walk me back. He did, surprisingly, and I got in his car and grabbed my taser immediately and my phone out. While we walked around the back of the car to his driver's side, I texted my mum SOS and to track my location. When I looked up from my phone, though, I noticed the guy had pulled out a pocket knife, and then he slowly laid the tip into my chest, just enough for it to almost pierce the skin. He just blankly stared at me, and this went on for a good 30 full seconds. I don't know why, too, but I just said, "You're not going to do it." And this seemed to snap him out of it, and he paused, and then hysterically laughed. Between laughs, he got out, "That's the second time I could have killed you today." The whole drive home, he proceeded to tell me about what he was going to do with my body if I had accidentally died that day. Well, I got home and I bolted out of his car, and as soon as I did, he sped off. I got some explicit pictures later that night, and then he blocked me. I looked him up, and it turns out that he was actually 27 years old and had a criminal record for domestic violence. That's all I could get on him, though, and obviously I reported it to the police, but nothing ever came of it. Probably because I wasn't willing to tell my parents what happened. But either way, it was definitely the worst encounter of my life.